Well, good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending upon where you are in the world, and welcome to today's DevOps.com webinar. I'm Charlene O'Hanlon, moderator for today's event, and I welcome you. As always, we have a great webinar on tap, but before we get started, we do have a few housekeeping items we need to go over. First of all, today's event is being recorded, so if you miss any or all of the event, you will have the opportunity to access it later on. Following today's webinar, we will be sending out an email that contains a link to access the webinar on demand. And we are taking questions from the audience, so if at any time during today's webinar you have a question for either of our speakers, please don't wait, don't hesitate, just use your GoToWebinar control panel and submit your questions, and we'll try to get to as many as we can before the end of today's webinar. Also, at the end of today's webinar, we are doing a drawing for 6 $25 Amazon gift cards. So please stick around. Hopefully you'll be one of our 6 lucky winners. All right, with that, we will go ahead and kick off today's webinar, which is 5 keys of DevOps and value stream assessment. Our speakers today are Jeff Keyes, who is VP of Product at Plutora, and Steve Pereira, who is founder of Value Stream Consulting. Hey guys, how you doing? Thanks for joining me today.
Morning, doing great.
Morning, thank you.
Awesome. All right, well, I'm gonna take myself off camera, put myself on mute, and let you guys get right into your conversation.
Awesome. Just by way of background, Steve, thanks for coming on this morning. I love these kinds of sessions because in my travels and dealing with different companies and different software pipelines, I get to come across folks like Steve. There's no end of vendor that's out to peddle another automation tool or this or that. And I find these sessions to get to the point of why and what we're trying to accomplish. And when I first met you, Steve, it was funny because it's like, well, I do value stream consulting. I was like, yes, woohoo, that's great. Let's figure out what that looks like and what does that actually mean. And in our conversation, I love what you're doing. And so what I'm hoping to bring everybody into the conversation is so that you get a view of what does it look like when you start to look at the entire pipelines, when you look at the entire value stream, and what are some keys of how you actually do an assessment of your pipeline and how do you make some improvements, some tips with that. By way of background, just so you kind of have an idea of, who is Steve, he created this really cool thing back in 2014 called the DevOps Checklist. Tell us about this thing. How did this thing get started, man? What was it?
Yeah, well, thanks, Jeff. I mean, thanks for the introduction. And, I really have enjoyed our conversation so far about value streams and where the industry's headed and where we see all this excitement and new opportunities. To bring us back to 2014, I think the landscape was very different. DevOps was very new as a concept. People were still wondering, what is this thing? How does it differ from something like Agile? How does it differ from IT service management? How does it fit in relation to all of these things? And I found that lack of definition was holding people back from really just diving in and trying to understand the value of shrinking the distance between development and operations. The very core of the idea of DevOps, looking at end to end, looking at the big picture and trying to remove the gaps, literally between dev and ops. And that's where I kind of started with this idea. It was partially an effort for my own understanding.
Sure.
I find, when we're creating content, when we're creating assets and tools and techniques for other people, it really forces us to kind of examine our understanding. And that was really educational for me, but it became this way of easily sharing, here's what I think, here's what I believe of this area. And what do you think? Not only providing something that people could sort of self-serve and use themselves, but it could drive a conversation about, do you agree with this? Is this important enough to be part of the definition? Is there anything missing? And it did change over time, and I ran it by many, many people. But I find that, it still stands up today as a pretty good comprehensive view. But since then, I've definitely moved on to very different ways of assessment and looking at the big picture and trying to collect all of that knowledge and move to really more actionable and tailored and customized approaches.
Sure. And that's kind of what we're going to talk about today. It's like, the point of assessment is to get a understanding of what's going on, which kind of takes us to the world of, well, what is going on in the world today of digital transformation?
Yeah, well, I mean, things are very different now that everyone has sort of tried to adopt these techniques and change the way that they're working to be more aligned with these DevOps principles and practices, because we have seen a lot of success from a lot of players in the industry. We've had a lot of success stories. Also in 2014, that was kind of the beginning of the DevOps Enterprise Summit, where Gene Kim and the IT Revolution team would collect all of these company cases of, we tried this, we've put all these practices to the test, and here was the outcome. And so this case really has kind of separated a lot of wins from a lot of losses. And what we're still seeing is
You're talking about the nationwide case.
Yeah. So,
yeah.
I mean, we're still seeing a lot of this transformation waste going on, where people are trying to adapt to new ways of working, and it's still 70% of the time failing. So what's the difference? What's missing? And a really incredible case that left a huge impression on me was this last fall, being at DevOps Enterprise Summit and hearing Nationwide present on their transformation story. And it really hit me hard, because they were talking about realizing that such a small percentage of their engineering and development efforts were actually providing value. And that's something I see very often, is that we've got all this effort, and if we start to measure, we might realize that we're not getting as much as we think we're getting. And what do you do in that scenario, right? I mean, the industry average for this is 15%. So 15% of your effort is actually paying off. That starts to hurt, And what we see is that a lot of organizations, they hesitate to even measure because they don't want the bad news, right? But once you realize that the bad news is real, and you have to deal with it whether you acknowledge it or not, you can start to improve. And so Nationwide really, they kind of dove into this, and they shrunk their release cycle. They really focused on value. And the thing that made the difference was assessing their value streams. And that to me just, it brings this transformation effort into reality, because this is a very tangible thing that we can do. We can start very quickly and very easily and see a lot of results.
Yeah, for sure. So I guess that kind of, gets us into the question of, I guess, how do you know what you're doing, and how do you know how you're doing? What's the process?
Yeah, well, I think the idea of figuring out what's going on is so crucial to transformation and adopting techniques like DevOps techniques or agile techniques, because before you make a step in a specific direction, you want to know, what am I surrounded by? Am I going to step on a rake the first moment that I set off in a specific direction? And how do you know what direction to set off in, right? So I think it's so critical to, not on a necessarily a continuous basis, but you've got to be periodically stepping away from your environment and saying, what does this all look like? What are we dealing with here? Where is our current bottleneck or our highest priority effort? We've seen, with COVID-19 and remote work, our current situation has changed, right? We need to reassess the current situation, even if it's only temporary. I would say that, permanently we're seeing environment changes, right? And that requires us to step away and say, okay, what is still true? What is now true that wasn't true before? And what do we do about that, right? Where do we focus our efforts now that our environment has changed? And that really requires us to sort of step away and look at the landscape.
Yeah, it's kind of funny that there's so much, I see it more from an executive point of view, right? Is we've got to reach this state of agile, reach this state of DevOps, and it's a destination. Once we get there, woohoo, that I get this land, and you're just trying to get me to the end of the road. And it seems like the idea of no. The whole point is we want to set in a place a system of continuous improvement. That's the point. And assessing is a very critical part of that. Because like you were saying, it's got to be part of our continuous process. So, well, diving into some of these tips and tricks around assessments and what works and what doesn't. How do you know how you're doing?
Yeah, well, this idea of maps and compasses, I find really resonates with me, and I hope it resonates with a lot of the audience here, because what we often see from assessments is we're measuring based on someone else's situation.
Sure.
And I see that as a compass scenario,
Yeah.
right?
So and so, deploys 3,000 times a day. Woohoo!
Right.
Yeah.
What does that say about me? What does that help me make a decision towards any specific activity, right? If we want to have advice that is actionable, it has to be related to our current scenario, right? Which means that things like checklists, even the DevOps checklist doesn't give you a prioritized list of what would be the most valuable next action for you to take.
Sure.
I could look at a checklist that's been completed by a company, and I could tell them based on my experience, here's what I would do. But that's not a self-service scenario. It's also, it's not really focused on the true bottlenecks in the organization. So conversely to that, what I see, well, complementary is really this idea of mapping. And it's more around what is our current state? What are we really dealing with right now? And when we combine the two, when we know what a best practice is or what tends to work for other people, and we combine that with what our current scenario is, our current situation, that's a really powerful combination. So I find too much emphasis on compasses really doesn't give us actionable information. Too much emphasis on maps doesn't really bias us towards moving in a direction, right? The combination is really the magic.
Yeah, what a great analogy. So what assuming that we do assessments and have some maps, are there other kinds of pitfalls in this process?
Yeah, well, this list is really a set of things that I find are often missing from assessments, and they can be some of the most painful or risky or the largest opportunities for teams. They don't show up in things like the DevOps checklist, for instance. They don't show up in things like DORA metrics or a lot of assessments that we see. And this is what I really enjoy about a practice like value stream mapping, is that because of the idea that we're combining a state in terms of a process, but we're also measuring that state in terms of the timing and the wait times. A lot of these things like momentum and delays, interruptions, they start to show up. And those can be the things that kind of drag a team down, right? And kind of sap our motivation. And over time, along with technical debt, what we're seeing is, you have process debt, you have culture debt, you have things that just slow us down and grind us. And over time, that impacts our ability to really move quickly with energy and excitement.
Absolutely. Well, let's dive in. These are good things to keep in the hopper of pitfalls. So what are we going to talk about?
Yeah, so really, there's a lot of factors involved in assessment. There's no end to what you can assess and what you can look at. There's definitely diminishing returns. You can't spend all of your time assessing, right? You have to act. But I find that if we're acting and we're assessing without considering some of the finer points or things that are often missed, we could get to a point where we feel really confident in an assessment, and then once we start acting, we're missing. So we're not getting the return on investment that we were hoping for. We're not getting the results that we were hoping for. And so these 5 points are really just a list of things that I find are important considerations when we're assessing to try and tease out those finer details that can really hinder an effort. You know, we find often that culture is a huge impediment to progress towards DevOps or continuous improvement.
Mm-hmm.
And a lot of these points are kind of culture centric that are hard to find when you're doing assessments.
So in other words, before you bounce down the path of let me go do the DevOps checklist or any other assessments or here's DORA metrics, you should think about these things. Well, let's dive in and see how they kind of fit. So safety, huh? What do you mean by safety?
Yeah, so I mean, assessment is a tricky thing, and I find that it's something we can't really take lightly because there are all kinds of personalities and experiences
Yep.
in the world, right? There's more diversity in our technology workforce than ever before, and that will only increase, hopefully only increase, but it's definitely going to increase. And what that means is that there's going to be people who are craving assessment. They're always looking for validation. They always want to know where they stand.
Yep.
And there's other people who are terrified of assessment, right? We
Yep.
have a spectrum, and we have to accommodate all of those different perspectives and consider them, and not only personalities, but also roles, responsibilities, accountability. And so a situation that always reminds me of safety is, and it was a hard lesson for me, to be honest, working with a smaller company where we did a value stream mapping exercise, and we just sort of dove in. There was a lot of excitement, a lot of enthusiasm. We wanted to get to it so that we could get to the action part. You know,
Sure.
what do we do? What do we actually do with all this assessment information? But what was kind of missing was this, I think, foundational aspect of safety where what we want to do when we're assessing is basically let people know that the situation is, we're not making a judgment, right? We're trying to figure out where we are. We're trying to figure out how we can improve. We're not judging anybody based on prior decisions. We've always done the best that we could. And the focus is really on what do we do next, right? Not what happened in the past, not who's to blame for anything. So it's really important to sort of set the groundwork early on when you're doing an assessment and set those expectations and just let everybody know that, if everything looks messy, it just means there's more opportunity for improvement. It's not a judgment on leadership. It's not a judgment on the team, on the individual contributors. So that experience where, I had a C-level executive who read my assessment and had, they kind of took it personally, and it drove them to kind of reflect on their situation in a maybe less than positive way.
Sure.
It kind of taught me to kind of lay that groundwork and be very specific about here's what this means. Early on, before we start, this is a safety exercise. This is a safe exercise, and we want to focus on outcomes, not history.
Right. Yeah. If it's sort of like if the executive side is going to take that personally, they're never ever going to get to a culture of continuous improvement because you never ever want to show that anything's wrong. Yeah, everything's wonderful.
Right.
All the meme of the kid, the guy with the everything's burning, drink. Anyways. So well, and that kind of takes us to focus. What do you mean by focus?
Yeah. So I think there's any number of places that we can focus when it comes to assessment.
Sure.
3 that I really find valuable are the idea of focusing on culture specifically. And when I say culture, what I really mean is like behaviors and patterns
Sure.
in the organization,
Mm-hmm.
the way that people do things, not whether you have ping pong tables or, happy hours.
Sure.
When I'm talking about performance, what we're looking at is measurement, really. What is our ability to sustain a specific velocity, to deliver volume. There's any number of ways to look at that, but it's more a measurement focus. Capability, I think, is really important, and we're kind of seeing a lot of increase in attention in that area because we often hit a lot of bottlenecks where, especially when we're trying to adapt new capabilities, what are the capabilities of our teams, of our organizations? What's going to allow us to operate in different ways, adapt and adopt new techniques and new methods and new technologies? So I think that from the very beginning, picking one of these areas just allows us to first not be measuring everything all the time. So it kind of puts some boundaries around our efforts. And it means that we can kind of focus on specific outcomes and actions as well. So I find that kind of starting from a focus that is targeted on a specific goal or an outcome is important, just to make sure that we're not trying to boil the ocean.
Yeah, because well, I mean, there's plenty of things there. So I mean, I guess you have to kind of get to what if you're gonna focus on the value of an overall, or what does it mean to have a high level focus, for example?
Yeah, so I mean, this is an example of an assessment. It's another self-service assessment that I provide to clients and people that I have discussions with. It's so high level that it's really of limited value, but it can give you some indications of, okay, what do we do next? Where do we dig in? Where should we be focusing our energy? And I think that's really valuable because what happens is you don't want to dive in before you sort of know the lay of the land, right? So an overall assessment could give us, maybe a stronger conversation to begin, and then we go from there and kind of dive into something more specific.
Sure. Well, I guess related to that, how do you get an overall focus on culture? What's that look like?
Yeah, culture is tricky. I find that because it's so individual and it's so focused on each organization, and in many cases each team, right? I mean, it's highly localized. So assessing culture to me has shifted away from, this is kind of a model that is based on the DevOps checklist. When I really wanted to dig into culture, I care about, what is the team doing? What are the activities, right? How do we respond to specific situations? Are we running retrospectives? Like, are we actually looking at what we're doing from a constructive perspective? Are we judging? Are we blaming? All of that is very important. So it can be hard, but I think it's important to look at culture specifically and try and measure what we can, which is, what are we doing? How do we quantify the outcomes of culture?
Yeah, totally. And I guess ultimately with that, we have to start looking at performance, right? Because you gotta.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, performance is ultimately what we are trying to achieve, right? I mean, it's where the rubber meets the road. And so I find one of my favorite ways to measure performance is this idea of value stream mapping, where we're looking at a high level process, but also the measurement behind that process. And there's many ways of doing this, but value stream mapping is absolutely one of my favorites.
Yep. Well, it's sort of the foundation. What about capability? When is this valuable?
For me, capability is one of those things that is seldom measured, but incredibly valuable when you're trying to create these cross-functional, resilient, scalable, autonomous teams. It's very challenging to think of the idea of measuring capability.
Sure.
A lot of people will, slide into defensive mode of, I don't like my skill levels being assessed, but a lot of people do like that. So you've got that same safety kind of diversity aspect. But I find that if we want to find real gaps, we want to find out what happens when someone goes on vacation, right? Or someone moves to a new position without having this overview of this is a specific thing that we need to do. This person owns it, and that person backs them up. And between the two of them, we have a very high degree of skill. it's very difficult to see or predict what will happen when we change the makeup of the team, or if people need training, if we need to move people to different areas to cover this idea of capabilities and activities and actions that the team needs to perform.
Love it. It's well, and you have some examples of, I like that you've given here some examples of some of the things you can kind of do to map out both capabilities, performance, and so forth when you get into focus. It'll help drive that for everyone trying to accomplish this. Well, and that takes us forward to, well, goals. Because without goals, you're kind of just going in the dark. So how do you make, but goals are easy to talk about and really hard to make the right goals. So how do you make good goals?
I think, there's a lot of advice about making goals, aligned to as much as we can through an organization, making sure that they're clear and understandable to teams, and then making sure that we can measure our progress towards them.
Sure.
So those are just three that I find are really essential, but they can often be missed. We can set a goal in the abstract, and it can be difficult to align to unless it speaks to people and it actually represents what they value and what they're really pushing for. And it needs to sort of flow through the organization, right, top to bottom. Mm-hmm. An example of a goal that has driven assessment in my experience was working with a company that was doing large scale partnerships.
Sure.
They would do integration partnerships. So they would have a 12-month cycle to build out integrations with a big opportunity in mind. And what they were seeing was this backlog. They had 4 or 5 of these lined up. If it took 12 months, there's really, you can quickly see that this is not a sustainable situation. So
Sure.
Their goal was really to shrink this down as much as possible so that they could run through these integrations in a reasonable amount of time. So the goal from the beginning was this idea: let's see what we can do to try and shrink this to 3 months. And so that kind of shaped our efforts, and it really kind of made the difference between seeing what we could do to what can we do to get to this very specific measurement, this very specific goal.
Yeah, I find with the different people that I've worked with and different pipelines, when people have gone down the path for improvement, actually doing this, this is, if you take nothing else from this whole session, please listen to what Steve just said. We're going to get this down to 3 months. How concise and clear is that? Everyone's focused on the same thing. We're going to get this down to 3 months. It's a simple statement, but it involves a ton of stuff. It's clear. It helps people align. It's something that's measurable. When you get into this process, if you just do an assessment and you don't really come out with any kind of outcome, you've totally missed the point. Set a goal.
Yeah, absolutely. And what often gets missed out of this assessment scenario is that, like, we need to do something with the assessment once we've done it. And that means that, it's not just going to be one person doing the work, right? Nobody gets handed an assessment that says, fix these 50 things that we identified. That means that you're going to have collaboration, cooperation necessary, which means alignment. And the goal is that North Star that everyone can aim for and make sure that they're headed in the same direction.
Yeah, I'll make an offer for you, Steve, just because I know you're that kind of guy. If you're questioning, hey, I need a little help on figuring out what my goals should be, please, I'm assuming, Steve, people can reach out and say, help me figure this out. That's worthwhile. Getting this right is really big. Just, and specifically because there's a lot of, every pipeline's an opportunity. It's a target-rich environment for different goals you might make. Do you want to talk about some of the example areas that you could have?
Yeah, so I think that often what we'll see now that a lot of people in the DevOps space are aware of things like the DORA metrics or these case studies from large organizations adopting DevOps and really making progress in this area, they will target very specific metrics, which is great, as long as we keep that big picture in mind and we realize that if you focus on lead time too much, you're going to be pulling away from a different metric, right? So this idea of keeping our goals aligned with a variety of different measurements means that we don't head off in a specific direction and too far away from something that we need to stay close to. So this idea of balancing our measurements and keeping a variety of factors involved in our definition of our progress reports, our assessments, means that we can head in the right direction, but not trip over things that are potentially interfering with that progress.
Absolutely. And when can you talk about some common goals that people have had that just to kind of give some more examples?
Yeah, I think another one that comes to mind is a very large, let's say, I think it's Fortune 10 company in the US, 80,000 employees. They got this mandate from leadership to spend $20 million on DevOps, right? And this might be a common scenario where it comes down
I've heard that
to
a lot.
like,
I got to go out and buy
budget.
a DevOps. Yep.
That's right. Here's a bunch of money, make it happen. But what was sort of quickly decided by the leadership was this goal of automated deployment, because they heard about it as the differentiator and a major factor, and it is. But what the value of an assessment in that scenario is that even though you've targeted this goal of automated deployment, an assessment can help you validate that, right? An assessment can help you make sure that you don't just take that goal, head towards it, and miss an opportunity for some greater outcome. I had this goal in mind, but we decided to do a value stream assessment, and what was revealed by the assessment was there were actually 2 other opportunities in the value stream that were easily 100 times more impact than automated deployment. And that's the sort of thing that I think is incredibly valuable, especially when $20 million is on the line, 12 months, 18 months of effort is on the line. If we're making 18 months of progress in a direction that's not going to make a difference in the value stream, then all of a sudden 18 months later we're way behind.
Right.
Those 2 areas that were a huge opportunity are now a huge liability.
Yep. Reminds me, if you haven't seen the talk by Jonathan Smart that he did at Enterprise Summit, I think 2 years ago, called "The PMO is Dead, Long Live the PMO." There's one like pivotal moment in the middle of the presentation where he's showing their pipeline, and in the middle is where the development team is celebrating, yay, we're so agile and things are working so well. But as you zoom out, it's like you see that there's an 18-month lead time before it gets to development, where they're figuring out what do they want to build, and then after the development is done, there's a 6-month process time of trying to figure out how to get it into production. And the whole conversation was focused on, are you sure you're focused on the right things, and making sure you get that right.
Yeah. And that's kind of the reason why this, we mentioned that the CI/CD pipeline in the context of a value stream is that it's a small piece of the big picture, and people tend to focus there and miss these huge opportunities on either end.
Absolutely, absolutely. Well, let's talk about resolving, value streams from a large organization. I guess we talked about some of those already, and talked about some of those bits, but I guess we'd have to actually start diving in to look at, how do you get to this point?
Yeah, so this is really the levels aspect of assessment, and it brings me back to another Fortune 100 scenario where as a facilitator, as someone coming in to do an assessment, it's valuable to have an outside perspective, because you're missing some assumptions, that you're missing that organizational knowledge that can bias some decisions and hide some details from you. So what helps is to level set and get a lot of context early on, so that you know what you're dealing with when you try to dig into the details.
Sure.
So in a very large organization, what I always start with is an extremely high level value stream, and quickly get an idea of what the overall organization is doing. And then we kind of dig in further and further as we identify sort of specific opportunities to dive into more detail.
Sure. So for example, I guess as you're talking about levels, you're going to look at what? I mean, what do you see when you dive in?
Yeah, so in this case, this is an example of a safe focused organization. So they had the idea of value streams and release trains, and in different organizations, program increments, things like that. And so it was very valuable to start at the portfolio level, because they had a lot of complexity in terms of products. There were many products interacting with each other.
Sure.
So what would happen if we dove directly into a product would mean that we would find all these dependencies and delays that were associated with other products, where we had connections, right? All these products are feeding into the same systems. They're all interacting with each other. By focusing too narrow, you get kind of a tiny view that's not very valuable. You might end up optimizing the wrong thing by focusing on, a problem that in the big picture is not a huge issue. But by starting big and zooming in, we can make sure that we're sort of zooming into the biggest opportunity by having by sort of starting from a top level and deciding where we want to spend our energy and time.
Sure. And part of that deciding to spend your energy, I'm assuming you start to hypothesize, like there's something going on here. So do you start at this level? Do you start at the next level down? When does that hypothesizing start?
Yeah, so in this case, I mean, if we go back to the example of automated deployments, you have a big budget and this sort of mandate to automate deployments, that's already establishing a sort of hypothesis that kind of our product development workflow is going to be the target of our assessments. Sure. and our efforts. So in that case, we have our hypothesis roughly, but what's really valuable in starting again from a high level is that if I want to bring leadership along, if I want to bring as many people along with this process as possible, then what I can do is start very high level so that they understand what I'm talking about, first of all, right? If we're digging too far into the details, you lose them immediately. And they're going to say, I don't even know what this product development thing is. It's not my forte, right? I spend all my time up here. So you start there and you can bring them along and guide them through your thought process, and that helps win that alignment and buy-in.
Gotcha. And then of course, I know we've talked about this of zooming in, once you have this hypothesis, how do you challenge or discover if it's, is that really the problem? Yeah, so I mean, at some point, or really at any of these levels, you could be running a value stream mapping exercise, and it's going to reveal, the timing that shows you where the biggest opportunity is. But a lot of the time, you can substitute that with some institutional knowledge, my experience. I can take a look at a value stream and say, 9 times out of 10, it's here. So let's focus energy here, because we don't have unlimited time and unlimited budget to go chase everything. We have to be a little bit selective. So what you do is, you drive this by hypothesis, and you always count on the fact that you're gonna discover a lot more about what's really going on as you dig in, and you can always zoom back out and try again. But
I've never been disappointed with digging into a value stream. There's always a ton of opportunity.
Sure, sure. Um, well, let's kind of dig in a little bit further. How do you know at what level to start measuring?
Yeah, I mean, that's an interesting sort of personal preference, I suppose. There's a lot of people in the value stream world that they stay really high level. And kind of a traditional value stream app is really a collection of processes rather than a collection of activity steps, right?
Mhm.
They never really dig so far into something like software development that they're seeing individual steps at this resolution that we're seeing here.
Right.
But really, my background is in software, in software development. And so I see a ton of value in really digging into the details. And that's where a lot of opportunities tend to pop up for me, because I can leverage my experience and say, most of the teams I work with, their issues are in automated testing, things like environment creation. So if we really just focused at the software delivery value stream high level,
Right.
all of that kind of detail would be hidden. And we might basically just end up automating our staging deployment, right?
Hmm.
But inside of staging deployment, the testing piece, the environment creation, that's where we start to see huge value, because there's a big difference there.
Yep. Absolutely. Well, and where does the validation of this hypothesis, how do you actually know that you're starting to validate it?
That's kind of when, we take this and we layer the measurement on top. So
Gotcha.
if we jump ahead a little bit into where we're digging into details, all of a sudden, once you add the measurement to this value stream, these areas start to pop up, because now we're comparing measurement to measurement,
Mm.
and it's not based on opinion, it's not based on a hypothesis, it's based on the real data on the ground. And this is where I see that kind of exponential value of something like value stream mapping versus journey mapping, story mapping, action mapping, all of these other techniques. The measurement aspect in value stream mapping really pops out here, and you start to see these hotspots. Sorry, I think I lost audio. Give me a moment. Let me check.
Yeah, I think Jeff, I can't hear you either, so I'm not sure if it's an issue on your end or on
How about
our
now? Can you
end.
hear me now?
Ah, there you
You're
are.
back.
Woo!
Thanks for joining us, Jeff.
You're welcome. How do you know when you've gotten to the point that how do you know that you're measuring the right stuff? Out of all the stuff you can measure, and that, how do you correlate that to your hypothesis?
That's a great question. I think, there's any number of things that we can measure, and some ideas and some that I commonly look at are in this kind of more detail section below. But for me, the most critical is timing. Like, time is the one thing that we cannot change, right? It's the immovable object. And so it's very important for us to be factoring in timing, and that kind of forms the baseline, the foundation for me. Once we have timing, we can layer on any number of additional detail.
Hmm.
For instance, it becomes very valuable in a value stream to look at handoffs. So who is doing the work at each stage? Because if it's different people every time, that's a handoff, right? Which means
Yep.
it could be a potential delay. How we hand off that work is really critical, because often, in terms where it's through a Jira task or it's through an email, we
Hmm.
could see 24, 48 hours before that handoff is actually actioned. And if it was the same person, it's just instantaneous, right? So a lot of opportunities for improvement are kind of addressing that capability gap where more people can do more things in the value stream, and that eliminates those handoffs. And so that becomes a very, very, very valuable thing to be measuring. In another case, we might be concerned with quality or value. Value is another thing. If we go back to this idea of nationwide, the way that they realized that their developers were spending 2.5% of their time on creating actual value was
Right.
by looking at the value stream and realizing, okay, well, you're performing this step, but what's involved in that step? How much of that time is waiting, fighting with your tools, waiting for an environment, waiting for someone to review your code? All those activities we can be measuring, and we can be visualizing that and sharing it with everybody from all of these different perspectives. And that's incredibly valuable, because we just come up with a goal and we're not backing it up with some sort of data. It's hard to get alignment. It's hard for people to say, I agree with you, and that's something that is definitely deserving of time and attention.
Absolutely. And we could spend a long session just talking about, lead time, wait time. There's a ton here.
We'll come
Again,
back to it.
Second big gym, take this list, think about it, because there's a ton in here when you start getting down to it. If you start putting some measurements and what are the goals that apply to this list of stuff, it's kind of cool. Well, and that focuses us really on outcomes.
Yeah. I mean, outcomes for me, it comes back to goals to a degree, but it's really, what are the results of,
Yep.
of heading towards our goals, right? How are we actually getting some results and some value out of this assessment activity, right? Because we don't assess for the sake of assessing. We should be assessing to drive action, to drive outcomes, right? So
novel concept, continuous improvement again. Well, and I like the way we talked about this too, because when we talked about this, you talked about this in a state of, it's before and after. And to put in perspective that really outcomes is what was it before and what is it after. Can you talk about this, like even this example?
Yeah, so I mean, in this example, and I think what's really valuable about using something like a value stream map for assessment is this idea that we can model the future. And we can not only assess the present, but we can start to use that data and say, what if this was 15 minutes instead of 3 hours? What if this was 4 hours instead of a week? And that allows us to kind of create a future design that forms the foundation for a specific outcome, right? We can sort of model it and simulate what the world would look like if we were to pull some levers and twist some knobs. Then all of a sudden we can share this with the team and say, here's what we're headed towards, here's the outcome we're aiming for. And that aligns the team towards this very kind of concrete, tangible destination.
Yep.
And it shapes their decisions, right? It's going to allow them to say, okay, well, if I do this, if I do it this way, is it moving me towards 7 hours or not? Are we going to be moving backwards by approaching a specific solution this way versus that way? So I see outcomes like this modeled all the time with value stream mapping, and the trick is really, to take that model and make it a reality.
Yep. If you haven't seen how to do value stream mapping, we have other sessions on our site. This is some of the details around what you'll do as you look forward. Here's some sample outcomes that you can look at, and again, tons of stuff that we could spend another hour just on this and get right through. But let's get to some of the final points here. What does this mean? Start where you are now.
That's kind of where I want to leave the presentation, and if there's really one thought that I can leave everyone with, is this idea that assessments, looking at our environments, looking at our surroundings, it's really for the purpose of figuring out where we are so that we can get to better from where we are. Heading off in an arbitrary direction, picking a compass point is not going to really help us take our next step. But if we know, if we know that there's a rake sitting right in front of us, that gives us a lot of valuable information about our surroundings and what to do next. And I think that, so assessing your surroundings, looking at what you're dealing with right now with a bit of compassion, because you got to where you are based on any number of influences and situations and decisions that we have limited control over. The real important thing is to take that step based on what works for you and what's going to be valuable for you.
Absolutely, absolutely. Well, I just to kind of throw in some other thoughts, I love this research from Forrester just so for multiple reasons. One, it demonstrates, there's two questions that they asked as part of this research. How often does your team release applications? We've all heard from a DevOps perspective, we want to release multiple times a day, woohoo! And yet when you look at the research, man, it's like so few people are doing that actually. And that's
Mm-hmm.
okay. So when you do an assessment, remember, you can always point back and say, hey, there ain't very many people doing that. Just because we're not doesn't mean it's not that it's not the right answer. It's just that's not where you are, and that's okay. We're still
Right.
trying to move and move our deployment frequency higher and our change failure rate lower and so forth. But the second big, most interesting thing out of this was when asked the question, how does your development team measure its success and status? The majority of people are just looking to answer the question, did we blow up production? Not, are we delivering value? So recognize that as an industry of people delivering software, we haven't gotten this figured out, and we need to. So why are we talking about this? Because this all seems, there's a side of this that sort of seems, warm and, fuzzy versus, what's going on. And why is Patora, a vendor, here talking about this? Well, there's a problem here in the industry. We don't think of software as a complete interconnected flow, and we need to. That's what value stream management solutions do. If you're not investing in this, you're missing the point. Because without this, you're never ever going to have a continuous system of improvement that will help connect from idea all the way into production, interconnecting other teams. It's really hard to do simply because there's different nomenclature, different goals. Each team has their set of stuff they're working on. Most specifically, they've got their own set of tools that they're working with. How do you correlate and integrate all those? That's what a value stream management platform does. If you think about the Platora solution, I think of it like I describe it like a 3-layer cake. There's an integration and common data model where we take data from across the tool chain and normalize it. We make the planning data correlate to the build data, to the source control data, to the artifacts, to what's being tested, to the environments, all the way into production, and make all this stitched together so you can have a unified view of the pipeline, as well as you can converge the tool chain such that when there's changes made in a test system, they show up in a planning system, so you can see, relative quality. If there's a help desk ticket created, maybe that correlates back to a defect that's seen, and all this stuff flows through. That in the second layer is managed by a management orchestration layer, so that you can not only see this data, but model your pipeline down to stages and gates. You can model your environments and know what's existing on them and manage what's happening with them using orchestration and automation. You can manage your deployments by having a run book as a series of steps that get executed by any number of teams and correlate and manage that together. The third layer of this 3-layer cake is a decision and decision-making analytics layer. Take all this data and put it into a data warehouse. Give yourself the ability to have insights, deep analytics and comparative metrics, so that you can have oversight. You can automatically produce compliance reporting off the pipelines themselves. You can incorporate your value stream mapping. And really importantly, using the tools you have, with visibility comes collaboration and efficiency. You can navigate the tools all together. You can see what's going on naturally. It's not about having another meeting. People talk about remote work as woohoo, we got Zoom. No, 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 no. The point is get your visibility from the tooling directly. And anything else, sure, have a meeting and do it. If you don't think this is something that's really cool, I'll tell you, there's all sorts of stuff that's coming out on value stream management as a category. Plator is a leader in this space. We've been a leader. We've been doing this since the time we got started. So give us a call and we can help work through the process of implementing a solution. A comment I'll make here. Sometimes I hear people say, well, we're not mature enough for value stream management. And my only response is, you're not mature enough to start implementing a process of continuous improvement. You're never going to get anywhere. And if you do make improvement, it's like a tree falling in the forest where no one can hear. Will anyone know that you made an improvement unless you have a system of measurement in place to help identify and prove you did better? Of the billions that you've spent on digital transformation, how do you know that you're doing any better than you were before? Like the most fundamental question. So look at value stream management solutions. Give us a call. We can help you out with that. If you're working on trying to know what to do, well, you have a friend. And Steve, tell us about that.
Well, thanks. I mean, and I just wanted to basically echo your thoughts on value stream management. I think that piece about measurement, you have to start measuring, right? Regardless of where you are, that's how you get to better. And I just want to plug your ebook on value stream mapping. I think, you know, it's a fantastic resource. So go to the Plator website and look up Jeff's book. But about what I offer is really helping companies sort of get started in this direction of looking at the big picture, starting to measure, figuring out what's going on, what they're dealing with, where their biggest bottlenecks are, because if we're not working on our bottlenecks, we're probably wasting our time.
Right.
So that's really what it's about for me.
Right, exactly. Well, we're quickly running out of time. There's a mass
time for
of questions. I'll try to get to a couple of them. Let's see. I totally agree with the view of value stream mapping importance. Often, what misses first is a common agreement on a definition of value and how to measure the business value. A super good point. How do you know that you're actually delivering value? I came into an organization and the result was we're delivering features. We must be doing okay.
Right.
Executives saying, how many story points are you delivering? Let's pretend that matters. Why don't we count keystrokes the developers are pressing? That's
Yeah.
Sure. Let's see. How do you perform DevOps gap assessment and DevOps implementation complexity assessment? I'll leave that to you,
that's a great
man.
question. I mean, that's really where I was targeting something like the DevOps checklist. So heading to like DevOpsChecklist.com, it's really a gap visualization system.
Sure.
You know, it's going to show you what you can check off, what you can't check off. That gives you an idea, a rough idea of gaps. But you know, it really helps to have facilitation to dig into the details and have something that's customized for your environment, because it's not covering hybrid hardware software scenarios. It's not covering complex vendor and supplier relationships. There's all kinds of things that are unique to each scenario, and it pays to have an assessment that's tailored to your specific environment.
Yep. Very cool. We got to run. Reach out to us on LinkedIn. Reach out to us on our company emails. I know, Charlene, back to you. We didn't leave you much time.
Not at all. How dare you? No, I'm kidding. No, I do really quickly do want to do the drawing for the 6 $25 Amazon gift cards. So guys, stick around. Stay with me here for a second. Our first winner today is Deanna M. Congratulations, Deanna. Hugo M. Congratulations, Hugo. Jason H. Congratulations to you. Michael W. Congratulations. Sue S. Congratulations, and William S. Congratulations. So guys, we are going to get in touch with you via email to get your gift card over to you. So please take a look in your email for that. Also want to remind the audience real quick that today's event has been recorded. So if you missed any or all of it, or if you just want to watch it again, you have the opportunity to do so. We will be sending out an email that contains a link to access the webinar on demand. The webinar is also going to be living on the DevOps.com website, so you can always go look for it there. Just go to DevOps.com/webinars, look in the on-demand section, and it will be right there waiting for you. Jeff and Steve, thank you so much for a great presentation. As always, lots of good stuff. So I know the audience got a lot out of it, and you guys had a good time too, so that's always a bonus.
Thank you, Charlene.
Thanks, Charlene.
All right.
And thanks,
Until
Jeff.
next
All
time.
right, guys. Also want to thank the audience for joining me today. This is Charlene O'Hanlon, and I'm signing off. Have a great day, everybody. Stay safe.